We now turn and look at the other side of the market, the seller side of the market, right? So this is when we focus on the supply. Supply represents the sellers. Again, you probably have a lot more familiarity with the buyer side of the market than the seller side of the market, but you might have some familiarity with this. A number of you, statistically, a number of you probably have had some kind of job before, either a summer job right now or maybe one during the school year, right? In a sense, what are you doing, right? You are selling your time, you're selling your labor in exchange for some money. That's you operating on the seller side of the market. It's just that's the labor market, right? We're naturally going to think of the seller side of goods and services, which is probably, you haven't played that role yet, as the more natural way to think about the supply side. But a lot of what we establish with the demand side, the same logic flows through. With sellers, we're just focusing on the other side of the transaction. Supply, and again, we're going to be really careful with our language, so we're going to use this term supply very carefully, maybe a little bit more carefully than New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, those kinds of mainstream business, good, reputable business journals, right? They get a little loose with their language, but we're going to define supply as, again, a relationship. Demand is a relationship, supply is a relationship between two variables. Price and quantity supplied. So here we go. We think about price from the buyer side of the transaction. They give up money in exchange for buying a good from the seller side of the transaction. They are collecting money in exchange for selling something that they had, either that they produced or they acquired or something like that, right? The price for a seller represents the amount of money that they receive in that transaction, right? And the quantity supplied, just like the quantity demanded, is a counting up, right? We're literally counting up the number of units that sellers are willing to supply at a given price. That's what quantity supply represents. So supply is this relationship between these two variables, and rather than being an indirect relationship, supply is a direct relationship, which means these two variables move in the same direction, right? If we're going to graph this thing out, again, step one, according to Alfred Marshall, we put P on the vertical axis for price and Q on the horizontal, but this time that Q represents the quantity supplied in the market. Rather than being a downward sloping line, it is, with a direct relationship, an upward sloping line. And I'm going to label that as an S for supply. Supply is the upward sloping line. We say that supply is an upward sloping line and that it shows a direct relationship because we can look at 2 points. Point A, point B, right? What happens? Price at point A, price at good B. Prices have gone up. Now, how have producers responded? The QS for quantity supplied has gone up. QSB at point B, right? When prices go up, the quantity supplied in a market goes up. That's the direct relationship that the supply curve is showing. And again, we can think about individual supply, though you probably have less firsthand experience with this, but this still represents, right? If we looked at each of those individual businesses, how the logic that they would use for the way they produce goods and services, if we aggregate it all together, this supply here is the market supply. It shows what all the sellers collectively would want to do. Does this make sense? That there would be an upward sloping line to the supply curve? Right? So think about a seller, right? They're thinking about how many units they want to produce to the market. They know that if they're going to produce some stuff, they're going to incur some costs. They've got to spend some money in order to make those units that they put on the shelves that they carry as their inventory, right? There's going to be a cost associated with producing goods. The price that they receive represents the money that they're going to earn when they sell those things, right? If suddenly the amount that sellers could receive, if their benefit of producing goods, if the price they receive goes up, suddenly they're going to want to try to capitalize on those higher prices, and they're going to produce a lot more units than they otherwise would. Now, producing those additional units is going to incur an additional cost, but, right, it's going to be justified by the higher amount of money they can bring in. Right, we're making this implicit argument that when prices, and again, this is a big if prices were to be higher in the market, that sellers would try to capitalize on those higher prices by ramping up their production. Notice that the converse also holds true, right? So what if you had producers in an industry and prices started to fall, right? How would producers respond to falling prices? They might try to close down some factories. They might try to close off some production. Some producers might even try to leave the market, right? All of those things are pointing to a lower quantity supplied to the market by all the producers in the market. Supply, again, very, very similar story as what we had with demand. We're just focusing on the other side of the transaction with people selling goods. Whereas with the demand, we were thinking about it equivalently as the willingness to pay. We can also think about the supply curve as being driven by the cost of production. And this ties into something that we're going to do a couple of topics down the road, but we want to first introduce it here, right? So as a thought experiment that I usually do in class that isn't going to work online, but as a thought experiment, I usually ask, who's willing to sell me their car for $500? And usually I get about one hand that's willing to sell me a car for $500. And then I ask for $1,000. Who is willing to sell me their car for $1,000 or $2,000 or $4,000 or $10,000, right? That really, in the decision to sell your car to me, we can think about that decision to sell your car. There are benefits, there are costs. Like any decision in economics, right? There are benefits and there are costs. What's the benefit of you selling your car? It's whatever price you'd receive from it, right? Whatever kind of money you'd earn from the sale of a car, whatever kind of money goes into your pockets, that would be the benefit of you selling your car. But what's the cost of you selling your car, right? It's not something that you produce. It's something that you already own. But remember, the economic cost of a decision is what you have to give up that you otherwise would not have given up. If you are selling your car, what do you give up? You give up your car, right? So really, whatever the money value that you place on your car is, whatever the value your car has, that's the cost. You're only going to sell that car if the benefit, meaning the price you're selling it for, is going to be greater than or equal to the cost that you're going to incur by giving up your car. Right? And so we can think about, from that same basic set of logic, whoever the very first person is to sell their car in the market, or sell their car in that hypothetical classroom, right? The price they're willing to sell it at represents their value they have to give up, represents the cost of their car. Whoever is the second person to sell me their car in the classroom, they're willing to sell me it at a price that covers their cost. That's the value of their car. And the third and the fourth, right? This fifth person or this fourth person to sell me their car, they're not going to sell me a car at a price that's too low, right? They're only going to sell me their car when prices have gotten all the way up here. Similar to the demand curve tracing out willingness to pay, the supply curve tells all the different costs of producing different levels of production. And we've got this basic pattern that we're going to explore here and later in this class, right? That as we produce more of something, as the level of production increases, what happens to the cost? The cost of producing additional units gets higher and higher and higher. Those first cars to come into the market, those were the ones with the lowest value, the lowest cost. The cars that took a long time to jump into the market, those were the cars that had a higher value, that had a higher cost associated with them. The more cars in the market, the higher the cost associated with those additional costs. Think for a second. My goodness, does this sound familiar at all to the story that we told in the assumptions of the production possibility frontier model? Right? What else do we want to talk about? We can do algebraically, similar story as to what we had before. We've got the first thing that we do with any of these graphs is we have to label the axes. So again, you remember what we label the different axes? Alfred Marshall says we put price vertically and we put quantity horizontally, but here this quantity is representing the quantity supplied to the market by all the producers. And we've got, similar to most, if not all, of our equations in this class, it's a nice little simple linear form. So I know it's going to be a straight line, and it's got a vertical intercept, and I know it's a straight line with an upward slope because the plus 0.2 tells me it, right? So again, I can just start this thing out anywhere. I'm going to start it here. Upward sloping line, sure, that looks like a great equation or line that might fit this equation. So what do we got? Our label this thing as supply. The vertical intercept is 10. Remember, what does the vertical intercept represent? It represents the value of the thing we're measuring vertically when the thing we're measuring horizontally takes on a value of 0. My equation here, P equals 10 plus 0.2Q. What do I know? I know that the value of the thing I'm measuring horizontally, in this case Q, is 0. So doing the algebra to work through this equation, 10 plus 0, P equals 10. And again, this is saying that when P equals 10, QS equals 0. Again, think for a second. Can you explain what that point represents in everyday language? Think about what price would represent on the seller side of the market, and then think about what quantity supplied represents, right? Price represents the price that sellers would sell their good for. QS represents the number of units that sellers would want to produce in the market. So think about what that point would represent. We can also do the horizontal. Actually, can we do the horizontal intercept? Is there a horizontal intercept? There is, right? It is a ridiculous number that's all the way down here. Can we solve for what this value would be? Sure we can, right? We've got our equation P equals 10 plus 0.2Q. QS that is, and the horizontal intercept is the value of the thing that we're measuring horizontally when the thing we're measuring vertically takes on a value of 0. Price, the thing we're measuring vertically, if I set that equal to 0 and I solve for Q, we've got, I'm going to bring the 10 to the left hand side plus 0.2Q, so divide through by 0.2, divide through by 0.2, and I've got Q equals negative 50. Negative 50. It's negative. Does that make any sense whatsoever? Right? Think about what that point might represent. And it's a little bit ridiculous. Clearly we can't have a negative Q. But I want to draw a slightly different line real quick. What if, instead of this equation, what if instead I had a line that looked like this? Can you think about what this horizontal intercept would look like in blue? This would be when P equals 0, the amount of quantity supplied. And I don't know what this number is, but let me just hypothetically pull out a value that's totally unrelated to the equation of 36. If this equation had a value right here of a horizontal intercept of 36, can you think about what that horizontal intercept might represent in everyday language? What would that point represent? Similar demand. I'm going to ask this great little question. What happens to the supply of oranges when the price of oranges increases? Again, we're trying to be really careful with the term supply. 3 possible answers. You could say that the supply increases. You could say that the supply decreases. And both of those would be wrong. The correct answer is what happens to the supply? Nothing. Again, just like with this demand curve, right? I graph out my supply curve, it's upward sloping, I do P, I do Q. If prices go up, what happens to the supply curve? Remember, supply is this line. What happens to that line when prices go up? Nothing happens to that line. If we have prices go up, what we're going to do is we're going to have a movement along the supply curve. It's a movement along the supply curve. And what will increase, right, is not supply, but rather the quantity supplied increases. Notice the question was, what happens to the supply of oranges? What happens to the supply of oranges? Nothing. The quantity supplied increases, but the supply does not change. Again, I'm trying to drive this point home because this is the way that we're going to use this terminology in our class, even though after this class you can read other sources, really good sources, and they'll use the term supply a little bit more loosely. That's fine, but in this class we're going to try to make a pretty strong distinction between the concepts of supply and quantity supply. Similar to the demand curve, that's how everything starts, right? We have a list of some non-price things that can shift that supply curve around. 4 main ones, 1, 2, 3, 4. We're going to focus on the first 2. Those are going to be the main emphasis of our discussion, right? So I have to the right this upward sloping supply curve. What can shift that supply curve? I know prices can't, but here we go. The cost of the factors of production. Do you recall what the factors of production are, right? The factors of production from our last topic, we said that those were land, labor, and capital. They're basically the things that a business uses, that a firm uses to produce their goods and services. And we pull out these 3 big categories of them: the land, the labor, the capital. Right, and I'm using the cost and the price of a factor of production. I'm using those terms interchangeably, right? I think about it as it's okay for me to use those terms interchangeably right here. We're thinking about how much businesses have to pay for the stuff they use to produce their goods and services. I'm going to assert that there is an inverse relationship between those two. Between what? Between the price of a factor of production and the supply. So that if we have and automobiles. Not that they will, but that they could receive for automobiles. Horizontally, what are we measuring? We're measuring the amount. It's a counting up. How many automobiles are they going to want to sell to the market? And supply is all the different combinations of different prices and different quantities. As prices go up, auto manufacturers are going to ramp up their quantity supplied. If the price of automobiles goes up, producers are going to ramp up their production of automobiles. But what if there's an increase in the cost of the factor of production? Can you give an example of what would be a factor of production for the production of automobiles, right? Again, land, labor, and capital. What's an example of land, labor, and capital that's used to produce automobiles? And now let's consider that what if that factor of production became more expensive? Suddenly, these firms are going to have a more difficult time making a profit in the industry, right? If their costs have gone up, their job of making profitable outcomes are more difficult, right? What that's going to do is that's going to decrease the supply to the market. So how do I show a decrease in the supply of goods and services in the market, or a supply in the market? Remember, with the supply and demand curves, increases are shifts to the right. If I want to show a decrease, I show it as a shift to, a shift to the left. Pause for a second. Does that look at all like that is an increase or a decrease in supply? I'm going to assert that that is a decrease in supply because it is a shift to the left. I took that demand curve, and what I did is I shifted it to the left. Now, some of you may be looking at this like I did the first time I took my microeconomics class, and I say, oh boy, that does not look like a decrease. It looks like that curve went up. Again, that's not right. With the way that Alfred Marshall constructed these things, don't think of it as up and down, rather think about it as left or right. This is a decrease in supply because this supply curve has shifted to the left. So this is what would happen to the supply of automobiles if there was an increase in the amount of money that they had to pay for their factors of production. If their labor became more expensive, if unions bid up the wages that their union workers could make, that's going to effectively shift left the supply of automobiles. Okay? Inverse relationship between the cost of the factors of production and the supply curve. That's a big one. Another big one is technology, but remember the way that we're using the term technology here, right? This is not quality. It's different from having a higher quality outcome. Rather, this is about the productive technology for producers producing their product. If they figure out a better, more efficient way of producing their product, what's going to happen? So we've got a direct relationship between technology and supply, so that if technology increases, which is almost always the way that it goes, I want to show an increase in supply. How would I show an increase in supply? An increase in supply looks like a shift to the right. That right there is an increase in supply. Increase in technology, increase in supply, looks like a shift to the right. Again, you can look at that graph just like I did and say, oh my goodness, that does not look like an increase, but you've just gotta remember, Alfred Marshall did this to us. When he put price on the vertical axis, it means that this is the way that we need to think about our graphs, not in terms of up and down, but in terms of right and left. Those are the two main ones, right? And again, I just focused on technology increasing because that's the most common way that technology changes, right? Technology, our state of knowledge of how we combine inputs into outputs, that's not something that decreases that much. It can, and there are a couple of historical examples, but most of the time it's an increase in technology. Number of sellers, to finish out the list, the number of sellers. There's a direct relationship between the number of sellers and the supply and expectations. This has to do with the expectations about how profitable different lines will be. So you could have someone like GM who's got two different lines that they're running, one on a small compact car and one on a big SUV. If they expect their SUV to become more profitable in the future, they might try to increase the supply of SUVs today. Right, that's the usual argument that gets made in terms of expectations. But again, the cost of the factors of production, technology, those are the two biggest drivers of these changes in supplies for many of the markets that we're going to look at. So that's what we're going to focus on. The other thing that we want to focus on, bringing buyers and sellers together. This is the story of what we call equilibrium. So we've got I've got a little graph here, and it's got price vertically, it's got quantity horizontally, it's got supply upward sloping, demand downward sloping. Equilibrium has two parts. Equilibrium is, the way to think about it, though not define it, is it's the place where supply and demand intersect. It's got two different components to it, right? One of those components, vertically, what are we measuring? We're measuring price. I'm going to use that as P star, but other books you might be looking at, other resources might call it PE or P with a tick mark or something like that. But I'm going to use P star. Equilibrium price, P star. And it has another component, equilibrium quantity, Q star. What are my two parts of equilibrium? The first part, equilibrium price, this is the price. It's the price in the market, such that at that price, the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. If I wanted to do this as shorthand, I could say that equilibrium price is the price such that the quantity that people want to buy is exactly equal to the quantity that sellers want to produce in the market. Every single buyer that shows up in the market, they're able to find a unit that's produced. And every single unit that's produced for the market ends up being sold. Everyone ends up being happy, right? Buyers, every buyer that shows up is able to buy the good, and they buy it rationally because the price that they're paying is less than their willingness to pay. And every seller is happy because the cost that for every unit they produced and brought to the market, the cost of those units is being covered by the price they're earning from it. So everybody's happy. Nobody's going away unhappy from this situation. It's possible they could be happier, but no one is unhappy with the situation in a rational market equilibrium. Whatever price makes that situation happen, that's what we call equilibrium. The quantity that's associated with that price is what we call equilibrium quantity. And a useful way to think about how this would go is to think about what if we had, if we were in a situation where we were not at equilibrium. So we're going to think about equilibrium prices is the point where they intersect. So I'm going to do a little P star here, and then on the right I'm going to do a little P star over here where they intersect. But now on the left, what if prices in the market were above market equilibrium? And then on the right, we're going to consider below. First, let's do this in blue for the demand side of the market, right? The demand curve tells me, right, at a given price, it tells me the quantity demanded in the market. So in blue, that's how many units buyers in the market show up and want to purchase. At this given price in red, in blue, I've ticked off the quantity that buyers want to purchase. Now, in green, let's focus on the seller side of the market, right? So in green, at this high price, remember, how do sellers respond to high prices? At this high price, given producers' cost structure and given that they want to maximize profit, This is the number of units that they want to produce. Remember, this demand curve, it doesn't tell me what buyers get to do. It tells me what they want to do. Same thing with the supply curve. It doesn't tell me what sellers get to do. It tells me what they would like to do. At these prices above market equilibrium, in blue, that's how many units buyers would like to purchase. And again, in green, at this high price, I'm going to tick off, these are how many units sellers would like to sell to the market. Notice what happens. For every buyer in blue that showed up to the market, those buyers in blue, this quantity demanded, were those buyers able to find a unit to purchase? Sure they were. But then what else happened? All of these units that sellers were selling or producing and bringing to the market, was there a buyer to purchase those? No, right? All these extra units are just sitting around on the shelf somewhere, right? All this inventory just starts piling up. There's not buyers who are willing to buy those additional units at that price. Step back and think about rationally for a second. If you're running a business and you start seeing a bunch of inventory piling up on your shelf, what's one reaction that you might have to it, right? Might you want to try cutting your price? That's why we say that if prices are above market equilibrium, we have this situation. We've got a name for this situation. If the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded, we're going to call that either a market shortage or a market surplus. What do you think it is? We refer to this as a market surplus. It's actually a surplus of goods that are produced for the market. Right? We've got all of these extra units right here. That's what the surplus is. All these extra units. If you're a producer and you start seeing a bunch of surplus inventory building up on your shelves, what's the natural reaction? Start cutting prices, right? That's why we say that, that's why Adam Smith said that he was such a big fan of these decentralized markets, right? We didn't need some central government telling us what prices should be and whether prices were too high. Rather, individual producers could just look at their inventories, and if they had all these extra inventories piling up, that's a signal to them from the market that they need to lower their prices. Or we could alternatively say there would be downward pressure on prices when there's this market surplus. Alternatively, what if they cut their prices, but they cut their prices too much? What if they cut their prices all the way down here? What if they cut their prices so that they are lower than the market equilibrium? Okay, so who are we going to do first? In blue, we said those are my buyers. So at this low price, how do buyers respond to a really low price? There's going to be an increase in the quantity demanded in the market. We're going to have all of these extra buyers showing up. And then again, in blue, all of these tick marks in blue, those are how many units buyers show up and want to purchase. But, how do producers respond to these low prices, right? If prices are all the way down here, given that producers have a cost structure and want to maximize their profit, they're only going to want to produce that many units. Remember, that supply curve is upward sloping, so when prices go down, sellers start closing down production. They might shut some factories. They might lay off third shift. They're going to do something that reduces the quantity supplied to the market. So yeah, all those buyers in blue that show up to the market, some of them are going to be able to find some units to buy, but there's going to be a whole bunch of buyers who are unable to find units to buy. Go back a second. How about at my market equilibrium, right? In blue, at these prices, this is how many units buyers show up and want to purchase. In green, this is how many units sellers want to produce to the market. Every single buyer that shows up to the market finds a unit to buy, and every single seller that produces a unit for the market ends up selling it. That's what we mean by market equilibrium. Another way that we can think about market equilibrium is when we have no market surplus, or alternatively, what do we call this? Quantity supplied greater than, or quantity demanded greater than the quantity supplied. We call that not a market surplus, but that's a market shortage. What's there a shortage of on the right-hand side? Right? There's a shortage of goods and services. All these buyers show up and they can't find units to purchase. Implicitly, we define our surplus or our market surplus or market shortage in terms of goods, not in terms of customers, right? Market equilibrium. This is the way that we can think about market equilibrium in terms of prices. there's a similar story that we can tell about equilibrium quantity, but it's a little bit different. To get there, we want to introduce one concept. So before we get there, right? Remember, equilibrium quantity is it's going to be located at the point where supply and demand intersect. It's the quantity where we have market equilibrium prices, but it's located where supply and demand intersect. We want to consider two different outcomes. On the left, let's consider a level of production, a quantity that's below market equilibrium. On the right, let's consider a level of production, a quantity of production, that's beyond market equilibrium. Okay, that downward sloping demand curve, if you recall, it represented buyers in the market, and specifically, it represented what they were willing to pay for goods and services, right? The demand curve tells, basically, what do consumers perceive is the benefit of producing goods and services. And what we see from a downward sloping demand curve is that those benefits diminish. The more and more we and the aggregate have something, the lower value we place on additional units. We've got decreasing benefits in a market. That's pretty true for most things, right? How about the supply curve? If you recall, the supply curve told us information about the costs of production. It told us how much producers would incur as a cost. So now I can ask the question, in red, this first quantity, is it rational for that first unit to be produced? Right? Remember, whenever I ask a question about rationality, I'm asking something about benefits and costs. Notice that I'm going to do in blue the consumer benefit. That's the benefit. In green, let's do the producer cost. How do those benefits and costs compare to each other? Are those considered rational? Is that a rational level of production? Yeah, right? It's not a rational, it is a rational level of production because those benefits are greater than the cost. But notice that the point right next to it also has the benefits greater than the cost, and so on and so on. So that point, it's not irrational to produce at a level below market equilibrium, but it's not the best we could be doing. Alternatively, we can consider a point that's beyond the market equilibrium, something that is to the right of the market equilibrium. Again, same story. This demand curve tells me the benefit of that high level of production. The supply curve tells us the cost of that level of production. This benefit in blue, the cost in green. Is it rational to have production that's beyond market equilibrium? So what I'm making the argument for is that it's rational to produce below the market equilibrium level of output, but it's not the best we could be doing, and it's not rational to produce beyond that if we produce right at market equilibrium. Hop back to this one, market equilibrium. Again, right at that market equilibrium, the benefit of that very last unit to be produced for the market according to that demand curve is just equal to the cost that producers would incur for producing that very last unit to the market. That's a kind of efficiency. Specifically, we refer to that as allocative efficiency, right? It's efficient when we have the benefits just equal to the cost. Below that point, it's not considered efficient. It's not irrational, but it's not efficient. Beyond that point, it's not rational to produce that much. So the thought example was something like this, right? As I can think about, right now we've got a number of automobiles in the US, right? You're probably familiar with this point. Could we triple the number of automobiles in the US? Think about the benefit that you personally would receive if you had 3 times as many automobiles as what you currently do, right? What's the value you'd place on a third automobile? Think about your willingness to pay for your first car. What's your willingness to pay for a second car? What would you willing to be pay for a third car? I bet that number, that benefit, is really, really low. Could we as a country produce that many cars, 3 times as many cars as what we already have? We could, but that would come at such a high cost. Think about, we couldn't just open up things and run them at third shift. We'd have to open up some new factories. We might have to try to induce some people to move away from engineering or sciences or some other things. There'd be a huge, huge cost that we'd incur to have that huge level of production. That's not going to be efficient. That's not even going to be rational. The last topic that we want to look at in this section of markets has to do with this thing that we call comparative statics. Oops, let me rearrange that a little bit. So what I want to do is I'm going to pull all of these out of the way for a second, and I want to tell this story a little bit bigger, right? So we've got comparative statics is when we consider changes to our equilibrium. And again, market equilibrium are prices and quantity when something else is influencing the market. There's some outside factor that's influencing the market. So I'm going to talk through this the long way first, and then we'll go through a quicker version of it, right? So we could consider the market for computer memory. Do you all know what computer memory is, right? So it's thumb drives and hard drives and all that kind of stuff, or maybe the internal storage memory on your computers, right? So this shows how old I am, because back in the day, spending money on computer memory used to be something that you would very carefully consider, whereas I don't know that you all spend very much time thinking about computer memory because it's so cheap. We think about computer memory, right? So I've got, if this is the market for computer memory, there's a demand for computer memory. I'm going to ask a series of questions on this, right? What is so the demand for computer memory, that's consumers, right? Does it make sense that there's an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded for computer memory? What's the logic that explains the inverse relationship between prices and quantity demanded of computer memory? We also have a supply of computer memory, right? This is an upward sloping line. Is there some obvious logic as to why there's an upward sloping supply curve of computer memory? When prices go up, does it make sense that quantity supplied would increase? What's the logic behind that, right? And we say that there's market equilibrium where these two things intersect, right? So we've got our P star is the price where the amount of computer memory that people want to buy is just equal to the amount that sellers want to put out into the market at that price, given that they want to maximize profit in their given cost structure. This is step one of comparative statics. Step one is simply, to the right, set out your entire market. Step two, identify the change in the market and show what would be affected. Right, so here we go. What's happened in this market? We're considering this market for computer memory when there's a technological advance. This is step two. We need to identify what's that change. In this case, the change is a technological advance. Without looking, which list was that on? The factors that shift demand or the factors that shift supply? If we go back to the ones that shift demand, I don't know that I can remember which one that was. We had income. Nope. Price of related goods, preferences, number of buyers, expectations, right? None of these things were about technology. If we hop over to the random guess supply curve, hey, I did that one right. Technology was on that list. Technology is something that shifts the supply curve. And what was the relationship? When technology increases, supply increases. So here we go. Back to our comparative statics question. Step two, identify what's changed and show how the market has been affected, right? So step two, technology has been advanced. We know that that's a supply factor, and it's an increase in supply. So how do I show an increase in supply? I shift it to the right. Supply shifts to the right. Step three, all right, identify the new market equilibrium. My new market equilibrium, what does technology do to the market? It's going to drive down prices, and more people are going to buy it. The other day I did pick up a little thumb drive, and my goodness, I'm just blown away at the price that I had to pay per gigabyte and how much 10 or 15 years ago I would have paid, right? It's amazing how much lower the price is of computer memory. Why? It's mostly driven by this technology advance, right? The production process of making these things and creating memory is just so much more so much better than what it was a while ago. And so this increase in the productive capacity, it's shown up in the form of lower prices. And when you think about the total amount of gigabytes that are purchased in the market last year, it's much, much higher than it was in previous years. Again, that technology advance allows higher quantity, lower prices. So those are the three basic steps of comparative statics. Again, step 1, draw out the initial market. Step 2, identify what's changed and where that change shows up on the market. That's where you think about this. Usually it's the last part, right? But what's the factor other than price that's moving in the market? And then think about, is that on the demand list that's pushing buyers either to or from the market, or is that on the supply list? Is that making sellers' job easier or more difficult? Things that make sellers' jobs easier, like a technological advance, are going to push the supply curve to the right. Things that make their life more difficult would be a decrease in supply and shift it to the left. So that was the long version of it. Now I'm going to pause for a second and reset to the original construction, and we'll go through the other ones. Let's consider this next one, right? So what happens in the market for fast food when there's an increase in the minimum wage? So real quick, again, are you familiar with step 1? Is do this basic graph where you've identified your P star and your Q star, right? That's your starting point for each of the comparative statics. But again, in your mind, go through. Do you know what all those different pieces represent? Vertically, what are we measuring? It's the price of fast food. Not the price of minimum wage workers, but the price of fast food. Horizontally, what are we measuring? This is the quantity. This is the volume of fast food. Demand. Who is that? And why is it downward sloping? That's the demand for fast food. It's downward sloping because when prices go up, buyers are going to try to substitute some other cheaper options, right? So higher prices, buyers reduce their quantity demanded in the market. The supply curve, it's upward sloping. Who does it represent and why is it upward sloping? It represents sellers. Why is it upward sloping? Because if they could get higher prices, they would try to ramp up their production and capitalize on those higher prices. Right now we have market equilibrium at P star because at this price of fast food, the quantity demanded of fast food is exactly equal to the quantity supplied of fast food. What happens in this market when, what are we considering? Step 2, there's an increase in minimum wage. What do you think happens? Is this an increase in demand, a decrease in demand, an increase in supply, or a decrease in supply? Minimum wage. Everybody knows what minimum wage is, right? Minimum wage is the minimum amount that labor has to be paid. The amount that you have to pay labor, is that on one of the list of things? Right? Right. Actually, we've got the cost of a factor of production. That is what an increase in the minimum wage is going to fall under, right? So it means that these producers of fast food, they're going to have to pay their labor more. Their supply, how is it going to change? Is it going to increase or decrease? Again, if they've got to pay their workers a higher wage, does that make their life easier or more difficult? That makes producers' life more difficult, so that's going to be a decrease in supply. I want to ask a question here, right? What would happen if prices in black did not adjust? If prices in black did not adjust, think about, all right, so if I take this price over to the demand curve, quantity demanded is not going to change, right? Again, if prices of fast food didn't change, does that have any impact on the buyer's value that they place on fast food? No, so they're still going to want to buy the same. But here's the more important part, right? If prices didn't change, but sellers had to pay their minimum wage workers more, what would happen to the quantity supplied? It would fall. What do we call this situation where the quantity demanded is less or greater than the quantity supplied? Is that a market shortage or is that a market surplus? And then think about, would that market shortage or market surplus put upward or downward pressure on prices? That's the intermediate step. We're actually going to skip all of those things for now, because once we establish that the supply curve has decreased, we can jump straight to the third part. What's going to happen to market equilibrium? When minimum wage goes up, it's going to end up pushing up the price for fast food. And when the price of fast food goes up, not as many people are going to want to buy it. There's an increase in price, there's a decrease in quantity supplied, again, because of this decrease in supply. You always want to make sure that you are clearly communicating where's your initial starting point and where is there a change. So it's nice to use some arrows throughout this graph to indicate where the starting point is and where the change is. Some of you may be sitting and thinking about this, but look at this increase in minimum wage. If we go back to that demand list, is there anything about the minimum wage on this demand list? There was the expectations, number of buyers, there was the preferences, there was the price of related goods, and there was income. Some of you may be wondering, my goodness, isn't income possibly part of the story? When people have minimum wage go up, for those people who are the minimum wage workers, if they keep their job, doesn't that mean that they're going to have higher wages? It will. For that, if we hop all the way back to our last comparative statics, hop all the way back, there we go, to our original comparative statics graph, there probably will be some kind of shift in this demand because of that change in income. But is it going to be very significant? If we consider the demand and the supply side of the market, demand is buyers. If a minimum wage worker gets more income, is that going to do much to the overall market demand for fast food? Probably not. However, the supply curve, that's the producers of fast food. If they have to pay their minimum wage workers more, is that going to significantly impact their business? Sure it is, right? So yes, there probably is going to be some kind of change in demand, but the change in supply is the one that's a little bit bigger and more obvious, right? I purposefully chose this example as one that might invoke that question in some of you. For later items like on the exam, it should be more straightforward in terms of which of the categories it falls from. But it's possible that we could have more than one effect at once. Let's look at a couple of other ones. Number one, what happens to the market for carrots when the price of celeries increases? So again, step one, I make sure I establish first my market equilibrium. So I've got my P star and I've got my Q star. What market am I talking about? Am I talking about the market for carrots or the market for celery? Careful, right? This is where the substitutes complements things come in. This is the market for carrots. So this is the supply of carrots, the demand of carrots, the price of carrots, the quantity of carrots, equilibrium price of carrots, where we've got a market equilibrium quantity of carrots. So the quantity demanded of carrots is equal to the quantity supplied of carrots. And now somewhere else in the world, there's a celery market. And in that celery market, for whatever reason, those celeries have become more expensive. Celery and carrots are economic substitutes. So what was the relationship between substitutes? If the price of a substitute goes up, it's going to start pushing consumers towards this carrot market, which will show up as an increase in the demand for carrots, which will show up as an increase in the price of carrots and an increase in the quantity of carrots. Yep. That's the full and complete answer. All that stuff last time about the shortage and surplus, it's built into the background of this model, but really this is what a final answer should look like with the three different steps to comparative statics. Lastly, what happens to the market for public transportation when there's a recession? Here we go. This is the market for public transportation, right? Public transportation, there's a demand for public transportation. There's a supply of public transportation, but think about that for a second. Who usually supplies public transportation? A lot of the times, that's not businesses, but rather that's some kind of municipality. We've got some kind of market equilibrium price, some kind of market equilibrium quantity. What happens when there's a recession, meaning people have less income? Ooh, we actually don't have enough information to answer this question, do we? Right? If you're paying close attention, we got to know, hey, when incomes go down, what happens to the demand? Does it go up or does it go down? We need to know, is this a normal or an inferior good? And in fact, public transportation, the data says it's an inferior good. So if we have an inferior good with that extra piece of information, when income goes down, what's that going to do? It's going to increase demand, which will shift it to the right, which will put upward pressure on the price of public transportation, and more people are going to want to use public transportation. And usually a good thing to do is, as a gut check, does this match what your intuition tells you. During a recession, yep, a bunch of people are going to try to flow into this market of public transportation, putting upward pressure on prices. That pretty much matches intuition, right? Lastly, what we're going to talk about is the algebra of equilibrium, but it looks like there's already a little video that talks through this, so I'm just going to put this as a placeholder and then reference that other video for you to go check out about how you might solve for market equilibrium, which is something you'll have to do on your problem sets.